This is BBC News, the headlines. At least 60 people have been killed and many injured in two bombings at Kabul airport. One blast occurred at the gate where US and British forces have helped evacuate thousands of people. A second happened at a hotel nearby. At least 12 US servicemen were killed and 15 wounded. The US said 2 suicide bombers from the Islamic State group carried out the attacks and that a gun battle followed the explosions. President Biden paid tribute to the Americans who lost their lives and said the attackers would be hunted down and made to pay for their actions. He insisted that the airlift would continue despite the bombing. Canada has joined several European nations in wrapping up evacuation operations, but Britain and France say they will continue. Thousands of soldiers from the US and other nations remain to be flown out of Kabul.
The headlines.
Welcome to our viewers in the UK and around the world. In the next few minutes, we'll look at what the papers here in the UK are saying about Afghanistan. But first, let's remind ourselves of what the US President Joe Biden had to say.
We will respond with force and precision at our time, at the place we choose, in the moment of our choosing. Here's what you need to know. These ISIS terrorists will not win. We will rescue the Americans there. We will get our Afghan allies out, and our mission will go on. America will not be intimidated, and I have the utmost confidence in our brave service members who continue to execute this mission with courage and honor to save lives and get Americans, our partners, our Afghan allies out of Afghanistan.
Well, we can speak now to Adam Weinstein, who served with US forces in Afghanistan and who's now at the Quincy Institute, where he specialises in security and the rule of law in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Thanks so much for joining us on BBC News. It's a dark day, isn't it, today for US troops, and this will heap even greater pressure on President Biden and his strategy.
Well, I think it's true that it's a dark day, but I also think it reinforces that it was the right decision not to continue a failed military strategy in Afghanistan. And look, we can talk about what went wrong with the evacuation, and that does deserve to be discussed and explored, and perhaps there are folks who should be held accountable if decisions were made that shouldn't have been made. But the reality is, had we stayed in Afghanistan and just maintained the status quo, we would have also seen U.S. troops targeted. And these ISIS attacks are precisely the kind of attacks that U.S. troops couldn't prevent. In fact, ISIS gunmen raided a maternity ward in Kabul in May of 2020, and there were still U.S. troops in the country and in Kabul. But ISIS in the Khorasan province, sometimes called ISIS-KP, has been terrorizing Afghanistan for the last several years. But U.S. troops have not been able to provide a solution to that.
You say that this, to a certain extent, vindicates President Biden, but these are the first US military casualties for many months. No US soldier has died since early 2020. That must surely call into question perhaps not President Biden's decision to withdraw troops, but certainly the manner in which the withdrawal is taking place.
Well, look, the reason we didn't have U.S. casualties was because there was a deal made with the Taliban, essentially, to not engage with U.S. troops, and the Taliban honored that deal in exchange for the withdrawal. Had we just blown past the withdrawal and we had decided to just tear up the agreement and stay in Afghanistan, I think the Taliban would have targeted U.S. troops. ISKP is a different story. And when you're dealing with a humanitarian operation in which U.S. troops are in close contact with civilians, and there's a non-state actor like ISKP that is able to mingle with the crowd, then that does present the possibility for something like this happening. And the U.S. mission in Afghanistan was able to target ISKP leaders in the southeast of the country at times, but it wasn't able to prevent these kinds of attacks in urban areas.
So President Biden says that we will complete this mission, the US will complete this mission. What does that mean, as far as you understand it? Does that mean that the US will stay there until the end of the month?
I think it means that the U.S. will probably stay there till August 31st. I can't speak for the administration on that. I think the idea is that they'll get as many Americans and Afghans out as possible, and then they're going to have to come up with a creative solution to get the rest of the folks who have been left behind. And look, the evacuation has not been executed perfectly. There is going to be a time and place when it needs to be explored what went wrong. But for now, I think the focus rightfully needs to be getting those people who are at the airport out and coming up with a follow-on plan for when the U.S. does withdraw from Afghanistan. But the events we saw today only underline how difficult of an operation this was, and that there was some risk in just having an open-ended evacuation that went on for weeks. And I think that's why the Biden administration had set a timeline, because they understood that ISIS was operating in the area and there was a risk of mass casualties.
OK, thank you very much indeed for your time. That's Adam Weinstein there from the Quincy Institute.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we can speak now to Omar Samad, who is the former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada and an advisor to Dr. Abdullah Abdullah, who was the former chief executive of Afghanistan. Thank you so much for joining us here on BBC News. Just to start with, what is your assessment of the situation on the ground now?
Well, the situation on the ground now has two focuses. One is the airport, the evacuation, and the tragedy that happened today. In the next 5 days or so, the U.S. and its allies will have to take as many expats, as many SIVs, and all of their own personnel. We're talking about 7,000 to 8,000 security and military personnel out of Afghanistan, as well as maybe select Afghans who are at risk. The other focus, obviously, is on what happens in terms of counterterrorism now. To what extent are the Taliban able to maintain security, instability in Kabul, in other provinces, not only over the next 5 days, but also beyond August 31st. And the third most important thing is what is going to happen politically. Are the Taliban and other political figures in Afghanistan going to agree to a power-sharing arrangement or not?
I mean, this attack does appear to have shown that the Taliban might be in power, but they are not able to ensure the security situation, certainly not around the airport.
What it does show is that something went wrong somewhere. Kabul is reported to be obviously under Taliban control, but they are the ones who have to assure security on the path, on the way to the airport. Some flaw or some neglect or whatever may have happened, we do not know. The U.S. administration does not seem to blame the Taliban that much for this, and they want to engage them to do a better job of providing security, of course, to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But overall, I think the Taliban have a responsibility, obviously, to make sure that not only the inhabitants of Kabul are safe, but that these types of missions are also given the security that they need in the areas that they're responsible in.
Do you want any further intervention? The UN is due to meet in an emergency session. Would you like to see UN intervention?
Well, it's not a question of one person or one group wanting to see something. It's a question of what is possible. You know the UN system. The UN system, through the UN Security Council, has to have the approval of the P5. The P5, I don't think, are on the same wavelength right now on what to do next in Afghanistan. So as long as there are differences of opinion, then you cannot have a consensus on the way forward. I think what is best to do is to make sure that the next 5 days go as smoothly as possible. The Taliban do what they have to do. The Americans have to do what they have to do, and the rest as well. And then we need to focus on the Afghan political transition and also on the state of the economy, which is really hurting people because there are no more funds coming into Afghanistan and the treasury is empty. So Afghanistan, after August 31st, is going to face two major challenges on the political front as well as on the economic front.
OK. Thank you very much indeed for your time. That's Omar Samad, who is the former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada. Thank you.
Thank you.
In the UK, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the attacks would not stop flights from leaving Kabul. Well, I'm joined now by Major General Chip Chapman, who is former head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence. Hello there to you, Major. There had been warnings about an imminent attack at the airport from the UK government, from other governments yesterday. Was this attack at all preventable, do you think?
Well, nothing is inevitable until it happens. And so the preventable bit would have to be between the interface between the Taliban and the American forces. Now, in security terms for the airfield, it was not a disaster because the perimeter wasn't breached. But of course, it is a disaster because there are 60 plus civilians killed and 12 Marines. And it is that interface between when you hand over from the civilian side or the Taliban side at the moment to the military part of the infrastructure where you have the real potential problems for all the disaster that we saw happening today. So it should have been potentially preventable by checks along the route from Kabul city to the airport. But there's lots of ways things can go wrong in Afghanistan, either through people or processes not being correct.
So what does this mean for the foreign forces that remain there now for another 4-5 days? How will they change the way in which they act on the ground?
Foreign forces won't change the way they act at all because the threat was critical to them anyway. And indeed, James Heapy's imminent attack threat, which he put out this morning, was not aimed at the military audience. They would have known that. It's really aimed at two other audiences. Firstly, the people who are congregating at the airport, who are the ones who are actually mostly tragically caught up in this, i.e. not be there. And secondly, to the population back in the UK, because the inevitable reality is that at some stage we are not going to be able to get all the civilians who are potentially entitled out of the country. And of course, if you have friction which delays things, as a big bomb does, that erodes your time. We have a fixed time working back from the 31st of August. We have 5 days left. 2 or 3 of those days we'll need to get the military out. The window is diminishing to get any civilians out in the future.
And yet we heard President Biden say earlier that every effort would be made to get certainly US citizens out after that deadline had passed. Is that realistic?
Well, my understanding is that the Americans have only 1,000 people left to get out. So those, in terms of the capability and capacity of the Americans, if people wanted to come out, they could. The British have been slightly more reticent to give you the figures that are entitled. Now, of course, there are different figures you could bandy around. So as at yesterday, there were 2,000 left from the ARAP scheme. That's the Afghan resettlement for the translator scheme. But then on top of that, of course, you've got people who worked for national NGOs, non-government organisations, and seemingly every private company that ever worked there has leveraged, sources back in the UK. So the number keeps growing. So under the NEO system, and remember that we went in initially 10 or 12 days ago on a non-combatant evacuation operation. Normally you would have a warden system where you would know those who are entitled. This seems to have expanded slightly. So that's the danger, that people are turning up when they shouldn't be there. And that also can lead to a real transition problem at the end. In crowd control terms, it leads to potentially a crowd surge. And that is why you need the Taliban to actually help out in making sure that you don't have large crowds at the airport and that you have this crowd management, because the real problem is when you transition to the civilian side is over and it's only military flights, and that will potentially lead to a lot of panic unless people are escorted away before that occurs.
OK, we have to leave it there. Major Chip Chapman, thank you so much. OK, time now for a look at the papers. Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the UK papers will be bringing us on Friday. With me are James Moore, who's the chief business commentator and columnist for The Independent, and Ian Anderson, who's the chairman of Cicero AMO, which is a public policy consultancy firm. And just a warning to you that the papers do have distressing images on their front pages. OK, let's start. Tomorrow's front pages then, starting with carnage in Kabul. The Guardian and papers across the world focus on the explosions in Afghanistan tonight, with dozens killed in the airport bombings. The Telegraph calls it America's deadliest day in a decade, as at least 12 US troops die in the blasts and 15 others are injured. The international version of the Financial Times looks at the effect the explosions will have on the Biden presidency, saying it has caused severe setbacks to the president's evacuation strategy. Hell on Earth. The Sun features pictures of children with British passports at Kabul airport hours before the explosions, trying to flee Afghanistan. The Daily Mail calls the attacks the tragic price of surrender, condemning President Biden's decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. And The Times features a photo of the wounded being carried in wheelbarrows to get medical help, as at least 60 civilians are said to have died in the blasts. Well, it's a very grim and sombre set of front pages that we have. I know you'll both agree. And they all lead with Afghanistan. So we will be spending our time talking very much about this story. I want to start with the front page of the Daily Mirror, which has on its front page the photograph that almost all the papers have. It's a very distressing one of two women with very bloodied faces. I think it's worth my pointing out that there is circulating some even more horrific material on social media that the papers can't show, and we most certainly wouldn't show, but, you know, they certainly give an account of how awful the situation was. I wonder if I can come to you first, James, and just first of all, your thoughts, really, about what we're seeing and reading.
I mean, it's horrible. It's just horrible. What else can you say? I mean, the image there really does bring it home shockingly. It is not easy to look at. I know when I first looked at it, I winced. And a still image like that can be particularly powerful at this sort of time, because it really does bring home the extent of the horror that's happened out there today.
In Singapore and
Yes.
7
Ian?
p.m. in Washington, where President Biden
This has been a grim month, and this has been the grimmest of days. I mean, just listening to Joe Biden earlier, incredibly somber, listening to Boris Johnson too, and I think, you know, the imagery that we see on the front pages, I mean, thank goodness, as you say, Reeta, we don't have to talk about what's online this evening. I've looked at some of that, and it's truly tragic. This is a desperate situation, and this has been the most desperate of days.
Let's take a look at some of the other front pages. Let's go next to the Daily Express, and its headline, 12 US troops killed in Kabul carnage. And we should say, James, it says 12, but there are reports that actually the casualty figure might be higher than that.
Well, I think that there were reports saying 15 injuries as well. We don't know how seriously some of those troops have been injured. And also, we shouldn't forget at this time that 60 civilians have also been killed. Some of them children, it seems, from the reports we're getting. So we know that this is producing a very interesting, I guess, political developments in the US because of the impact on the Biden presidency. And it's not clear that the two parties are they're both rather split on this. Mitch McConnell, the Republican, came up with some very, very strong words about this today, and some Democrats are quite queasy about the withdrawal, but others are in support of it. So both big US parties are fractured about this, but you can only look at it and feel dreadful, I think.
Ian, the front page of the Financial Times, and we are showing here the international edition of the Financial Times, makes the point that James is making, that the explosions heap pressure on President Biden's strategy. And I think the point being made is that even people who agree that America and President Biden was right to withdraw troops are questioning the speed at which that was done and the manner, therefore, in which it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, to build on what James is saying, I think one of the most unedifying things this evening is to watch a sort of traditional political slanging match going on between Republicans and Democrats. Look, you know, a Republican president, Donald Trump, set in train this strategy. Biden's continued the strategy. Huge debate as to whether or not that was the right thing to do. But I think party politics shouldn't come anywhere near what we're seeing this evening. I was quite struck watching the president's press conference earlier. You know, he talked about, obviously, as president, he's had to call the relatives of the 12 American dead service personnel. He was talking about his own experience. He's talking about his family's experience. Obviously, his son, Beau, who served in Iraq, had died. And I couldn't help but get this feeling of, if you like, unfinished business. He's wanted to end this war because it's meant something to him and his family, just as George W. Bush wanted to start this war 20 years ago because there was unfinished business from his father's own legacy. It struck me really powerfully that tonight.
Interesting. James, the front page of the Eye, your own paper, refugees and US Marines murdered side by side. Refugees, I suppose, actually, you'd want to say would-be refugees, people who want to be refugees, people seeking refuge, but who actually didn't make it.
Well, the terrible thing about what's happening out there and the chaos of the withdrawal is you have got these large crowds of people milling about. It's disorganized, it's chaotic, and unfortunately, when you have a security situation which is as volatile as it is in Afghanistan, it's catnip to organizations like ISIS. I imagine that America will want to strike back, and I imagine it will want to strike back hard. Certainly, Joe Biden in his statement has said that. But yeah, that's the fear is, I think now, is whether we see more like this. Certainly, the reports seem to suggest that there will be more attempts like this, and the situation out there is making that quite likely, I fear.
Yes. The front page of the Times, the main story, of course, scores killed in Kabul attack. But just below that is an exclusive by Anthony Lloyd in Kabul about embassy left details of Afghan staff for Taliban to find. Ian, tell us about this.
Yes, this is a very important story. But basically, you know, I think we've seen pictures of the British Embassy, really brave work by the US Embassy team and the British ambassador staying to support the evacuation effort. The Times has this story of some files being found and not shredded in the British Embassy, identifying some members of the Afghan community that had supported the UK military and diplomatic effort. That's obviously tragic to read, but one can understand. This has been a desperate situation. I think the British Embassy have done as much as they can. I mean, myself, I've been involved with my own charity supporting LGBT people in order to try and get some of them out of this situation. It's a desperate situation, and I can understand why this has happened.
I want to just read to you a response from the Foreign Office in relation to this story. A Foreign Office spokesperson has said, "We've worked tirelessly to secure the safety of those who worked for us in Afghanistan and continue to do so. Crucially, we've now been able to get these 3 families to safety." So there are 3 families in that article by Anthony Lloyd. The drawdown of our embassy was done at pace as the situation in Kabul deteriorated. Every effort was made to destroy sensitive material. And a source from the Foreign Office says, "We're grateful to the Times for sharing the information retrieved with us and working with us to enable us to get these 3 families to safety." We are going to have to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed, Ian Anderson and James Moore there. Thank you. Coming up next is Newsday. You're watching BBC News.